Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Prynhawn da, hi chi gyd. That's good afternoon to those of you who don't come from Wales, in Welsh. I'm Jane Davidson, and the reason that I'm sitting on the stage with Chris Smaje, who's going to talk to you in a moment, is that there is a book publishing company called Chelsea Green. And many of you may already know Chelsea Green. It largely operates in the United States, and its whole work since it started has been focused on sustainability. And interestingly, it decided to move into the UK a couple of years ago, and it chose 5 authors in order to start its work in the UK. And I was one of them. And Chris was one of them. So we hadn't met until our books got published. And mine was Future Gen Lessons from a Small Country, and I'm going to be talking about that in my session tomorrow here. And Chris's, the first book he wrote, was about a small farm future. Now, Chris is one of those polymath human beings. You know, people don't just define themselves in one way. And when I asked him today how he would define himself, he said a small-scale farmer and social scientist. And I thought, no, he's much more than that. For a start, he is got a rigorous intellect. And in both his books, and he's going to be talking about his second book particularly today, in both his books, he absolutely looks at what needs to happen in order to create a better future around the future of food, and the really, really important opportunity we have to totally redefine how we use our landscape in a way that's good for us all. And at a time when we've seen all sorts of debates about land sparing and land sharing and removing livestock off lands completely and going through factory-fed food as an alternative, it's a really refreshing look at what we might do for the future. Now, I just want to, in asking Chris to introduce himself, I'm going to do something really unusual, but it goes back to my life, my very early life as an English teacher, where I'm going to ask him to define 3 terms, because I've had Chris in my ear for a week now, listening to his book, and these 3 terms come up a lot in his thinking. And the book itself, he initially started as a sort of polemic of rage against the idea that there would be a farm-free future. And then this polemic, which actually was going to be a short polemic, turned into a book. So there's a lot of material that Chris has, but fundamentally, he is offering us a magic hope for the future. But the magic of the hope is we can do this stuff. So Chris, please, in introducing yourself, can you start with the term local agrarianism?
Right. Thanks very much. Thanks for that intro, Jane. And I have brought some copies of my books here, and I'm on my bike, so I'm hoping that a few people will buy them to lighten my load on the way home. Local agrarian localism. I mean, in a way, it's sort of they are what they say they are. Agrarianism, food is produced fundamentally in farms and gardens. Hands up here, who's eaten some food in the last few days that have come from a farm or a garden? Okay, so we're all agrarians. Okay, most of us maybe in modern society, we don't necessarily produce food for ourselves, or we don't necessarily know that much about where our food has come from, but that's kind of my argument, is that we all, in whatever way we can, one way or another, we need to take more of an interest in the food system and take a more active involvement in how, where our food comes from and sort of how we produce our food. The localism is really that the whole way that the global food system has gone is that whichever part of the world you're in, it has got drawn into producing, whatever the easiest, cheapest type of food that it can sell most advantageously into global markets is. That has pushed a kind of dynamic of overproduction that's bad for nature, bad for the ecology, bad for people, really. Creates all sorts of social inequities and problems, and we need to relocalize it at all sorts of levels and in all sorts of different ways. But fundamentally, my argument is that we need to have more feedback about the food system. If you're producing food locally, if you're growing your own garden, for example, if you do something, you get some ecological feedback. You see the consequences of your actions. It has an impact on the wildlife or the soil health or whatever, and you learn from that and sort of trim your practice. Likewise with the economics of food, if you're producing food for yourself or your community, you get some feedback as to the work that you put in, the reward that you get. And we've kind of lost that by this global dynamic of overproduction. So basically agrarian localism is about taking responsibility for our food again and sort of putting ourselves, making ourselves protagonists in whatever way we can in those local food systems.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. And it was interesting that you asked the question, because so many people in this room are already, in a sense, adopting that by putting your hands up, by actively seeking out ways of supporting the local economies. Now, just two other terms before you talk about, hopefully you'll say a little bit about your first book and then what's led to the second. Eco-modernism and manufactured food.
Right. So eco-modernism are the kind of baddies in my account. I guess the basic idea of it is that we live in a very high-tech, high-capital, high-energy world. And the idea of the eco-modernists is that that world has created all sorts of ecological problems that we all know about. The argument of the eco-modernists is that kind of the only way out of that is more of the same. We need more energy, more high techiness, and so on. So typically there are the sort of four key planks to it. It's very much pro-urbanism. The eco-modernist vision is more and more of us living in big cities. It's in order to do that, it's pro-high energy. Obviously, we can't keep using fossil fuels, so the eco-modernists tend to, typically favour nuclear power, but basically it's a high energy vision, like trying to decarbonise the energy system, which we're not doing a very good job of right at the moment. But the idea is that we need to decarbonise the energy system, but still expect to have very high levels of the kind of high energy systems that we're used to in the modern world. The third aspect of it is biotech. So basically, originally a lot of this arose around GM crops, but the manufactured food idea that we'll be talking about is the kind of new iteration of that. And then the other idea, which I broadly support, is less pressure on nature, rewilding, letting nature back into the landscape. I think I broadly support that. The devil is in the detail, really, of how we do that. But those are the kind of the four key arguments, really, of eco-modernism. And manufactured food. So, my book, in some ways, it arose out of a critique of George Monbiot's book, Regenesis, that many of you will perhaps be familiar with, or certainly familiar with George's writings over the years. George, at the end of his book, amplifies this new technology. Manufactured food can cover a multitude of things. The idea is sort of lab-based food. A lot of people talk about lab-based, lab-grown meat or what have you. The particular technology that he focuses on in his book and that I write about in mine is what some people call precision fermentation. You'll probably see this a lot in the news. I think it's a little bit of a PR term, and I tend to just use the term manufactured food. But I think it's probably useful if I just take a minute to explain what it is, because it's not clear. The processes aren't that clear to a lot of people. So the idea of this is that you take a particular type of bacteria, a hydrogen oxygenating bacteria, and you grow it in a steel bioreactor. and that it kind of multiplies, produces this slurry of dead microbial matter. There are some questions about how healthy that is. There's various nucleic acids and endotoxins that you have to get out of it, but you end up with a kind of very high protein powder or kind of, sort of a tofu type of matter, or a high protein flour that you can then eat, supposedly. There's a lot of issues with it, but fundamentally it's like energizing the process. So you basically have to feed it hydrogen and oxygen and a bunch of other things to get, the way that we mostly get hydrogen to use in industrial processes days is through using fossil fuels, through turning natural gas, getting hydrogen out of natural gas. If we're wanting to do this in a low carbon way, you can't do that. So what you have to do is electrolyze water. That means using clean, low carbon electricity to split water into its constituent parts. That means probably using mostly PV power or possibly nuclear power. You can energize it in different ways, but it's a tremendously energy intensive process. We're trying to decarbonize the energy system. We've got issues with transport, steel making, construction. All of these industries are clamoring for low carbon electricity, whereas in farming, we have the sun. We have this zero carbon free energy source. That's what farming does. It's diffuse. That's why historically people have spread out. That's why historically we haven't been highly urbanized, because we have to spread out in the landscape and make use of the sun. But what this technology is trying to do, the argument in favor of it is that you can produce more protein per acre than you can with traditional farming techniques, but you have to use generated electricity. So really, if this is going to work at scale, you have to assume that we're going to have orders of magnitude more generated electricity than we currently do. And, we're not even managing to decarbonize the energy system as it is. So in my view, there's a whole bunch of problems with it, but people will tell you it's more efficient, but that's kind of the wrong question. The cost is what's important, not the efficiency. It's like an electric motor is more efficient than the human body, but you don't buy a Tesla in order to walk down to visit your neighbour. Okay, so it's not about efficiency, it's about the energetic cost of this process. So that's kind of my argument in the book, is that this really is a non-starter, and we need to be thinking, for sure we need to be changing the farming system, making it much more nature-friendly, making it much more people-friendly, but the manufactured food route is not really a good route to try and do that.
No. I mean, I think that what's interesting in what Chris has just said is there is a lot of empirical detail in your book, deliberately so, in terms of looking at how difficult it might be to deliver an alternate food system, such as manufactured food, and what the costs could be, the energy costs, the human costs in the context of people coming off the land, the number of people who would have to come off the land, all those sorts of issues. But I think we should go back to basics for a moment. I mean, I'm an organic smallholder. I keep sheep, I keep pigs, I keep ducks, I keep chickens, I keep turkeys, sequentially, because it all depends on how much room is in the freezer. And we try and live as low carbon lives as we can. And we know that our organic work, where we are in North Pembrokeshire, where we had no soil to begin with, we were on shale. And over 10 years, we have managed organically to create enough soil using our own fertiliser, using seaweed, etc., and others using horse poo and all sorts of things, in terms of actually creating the opportunity to grow on land which would have been deemed peripheral sheep grazing. So we know we can do some of this stuff. And you love what you do. I mean, you've got a much bigger farm than me, and you work commercially with it. Perhaps it would be good for you to sort of say what you do, and then how you see that sort of opportunity expanding in what we either call local agrarianism or agrarian localism.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, we're based in Somerset. We've got. I mean, again, really, we're smallholders. We started a small market garden about 15 years ago. Valis Veg. We do a little local veg box scheme. See, some Frumies here who can tell you all about Valis Veg. But yeah, it's been a journey, and in some ways, what drew me back to the social science, really, you know, I was an academic social scientist and sort of took a wrong turning on the way to the seminar room and ended up running a veg box scheme, and I've sort of got drawn back a bit more to the writing, and other people such as my wife Cordelia now are working much harder on the veg growing. But yeah, it's sort of, you know, part of what drew me back to the writing is, you know, why is this so difficult? You know, why is it so hard to, you know, to have you know, small scale local farming that's geared to community and local needs. So in some ways, my first book, A Small Farm Future, was sort of about that. But you know, that it sort of goes back to the point I made about overproduction of and over commodification, the sort of the way that each part of the world is pushed to produce its most advantageous product. I mean, like more or less everywhere you can grow fruit and vegetables, and that's kind of what humans, you know, we're built to eat. That's what we should be eating. I mean, it's an absolute tragedy and a crime in my view that fruit and vegetables are almost now luxury food. You know, poor people can't afford to eat fruit and vegetables, and you can grow them really easily everywhere with access to land. So, you know, land access is a critical sort of political issue underlying all this. But, you know, we tend to buy the UK that could easily produce, you know, almost all of its fruit and veg. You know, we tend to import it from Spain or the Netherlands or other countries, you know, just as a result of a whole bunch of things that we probably shouldn't get too drawn into. You know, energy is cheap, human labour is dear. Rich countries like the UK tend to import labour-intensive products from other countries with different labour profiles, and you know, obviously in Wales there's a whole issue about upland farming and sheep farming and so on. But you know, we need to diversify, but we can only diversify if we sort of get back to producing the diversity of foods that's good and healthy for us within our communities, not by sort of churning out agricultural commodities as much as we can. You know, the most advantageous one or two agricultural commodities that we can produce locally. And you know, globally, something like 60 or 70% of global cropland is devoted to just 10 crops, of which the big ones are wheat, maize, rice and soy. You know, these are all kind of commodity industrializable crops, and you know, I mean, the reason that we produce so many of them is because they're good in their own way. You know, you can do good things with them, but you can have too much of a good thing, you know. So we need to diversify locally and make a much more diverse diet available to everyone.
Right, yeah. Now, I think one of the things that's so interesting about horticulture is I discovered about 5 years ago when I was working with a PhD student that we only grow around about 2% of our fruit and vegetables in Wales. 2% of the fruit and vegetables that our population needs, our 3 million population needs in Wales. Now, don't you think that's shocking? Actually, it's the same proportion in other parts of the UK as well. But, you know, so we just don't look at issues around food security, and not in the kind of like we've got to kind of keep our food for us, you know, in this sort of wall around the country type approach, but just on the notion about surely you start with food on the basis you have enough in your own country. And if we did, we would have a completely different debate about fruit and vegetables being available to people of all incomes as well. So it's really quite shocking how dislocated our food system is. And that's partly what you're trying to address, aren't you? Manufactured food that is predicated as one answer may be something that actually leads to a dystopian future. But actually, what do you think would happen if we lost farming?
Yeah, I mean, that's good question, and I think this is something that's again worth being cautious about when you hear these manufactured food narratives. You'll hear people say, "Oh, it's really great because you can just have a little." Food manufacturing, maybe sort of shipping container style factory with some stainless steel bioreactors churning out this high protein food locally. But that's not how it's going to work in practice. I mean, if you think about every other manufacturing process, how localized and distributed is it? Now, the pro manufactured food people say, well, look at the food system. That's pretty corporatized, and it is, but it's much less corporatized than basically any manufacturing sector, because it's harder to generate economies of scale economically and politically. So, even though, as Jane was saying, we have these dreadful figures like only 2% of vegetables grown in Wales, but what percentage of cars that are driven in Wales, or what percentage of computers or mobile phones that are used in Wales are manufactured there? When we're talking about manufacturing industry, we're looking at global economies of scale. And that's another issue. What happens if there's no farming? There is a long-term narrative of expropriation and enclosure that I think is behind this, and very often it's presented in a benign light. It's like, look at all these poor farmers struggling on their holdings. Wouldn't it be great if we could just produce food, through these high-tech manufactured routes and release them from farming? You need to have a very good account as to what happens to those people when that happens. Historically, what happens is, rural underemployment, unemployment, people being pushed into cities, and we're now and this to me is a particular worry that I talk about a little bit in this book. I mean, we're already at a stage of precarity and underemployment and sort of swelling slum cities where the same process that is the case in agriculture is also the case in manufacturing industry, that there's a dynamic of overproduction, getting labour out of manufacturing, and that's been the real growth push historically in the last century or two, pushing people into more precarious service sector jobs that don't really generate long-term prosperity. And then there's a whole level of geostrategic threat as well, when we're looking at energy futures, geopolitical futures, the way that the different power centres of the world are jockeying around energy and resources and water. So we're very much, to use an agricultural metaphor, if we're saying let's get people out of farming, let's get them into cities, that'll be good, they'll be rich there. We're putting all our eggs in one basket, and we're putting it in a very fragile basket, increasing. If we were having this discussion 100 years ago, it would be different. I think we tend to sort of look back too much to say, get people out of agriculture, get them into cities. That might have been a good argument. I mean, I happen to actually not think it was a great argument even a century or two ago, but I think it's an especially bad argument now when we're looking at the kind of issues we're facing about energy futures and so on. So yeah, it is, and these sort of arguments about enclosing the commons or, agricultural improvement, they're very often presented as pro-poor, get people out of farming, give them something better to do. But that's not often how it pans out, and I don't think it will be how it will pan out in this case.
I think it's quite interesting, I think, this notion about cities, because of course many of our cities are coastal. And actually, if you want to terrify yourselves, just read the two books that I've just read. One's called The Waters Will Rise, and the second one's called The Heat Will Kill You First. and I'm afraid that they are real wake-up calls, in the sense that, our cities were deliberately on coasts, because of course that they were, many of them were built in medieval times, and certainly through the big expansion in Victorian times, etc. But I think there's something also that's potentially been lost in that relationship between the city and where it's fed from. So how would you ideally look at the relationship between the city and food creation?
Yeah, good question. I mean, historically, you tend to get the sort of big colonial cities, sort of London or Rome, and they're very much based on seaborne trade historically, because that was relatively efficient. So again, we get back to the grains, wheat and so on is very easy to transport big distances, whereas fruit and veg isn't. But I think we do need to, reinvigorate, small market towns like Frome, where on the edge where I live, it used to be, you can see some of the buildings in the town that very much used to be agricultural buildings with, lots of, the cheese and grain where we all go now listen to music. You don't have to probe too far into the history of that term to sort of think about, what it used to be doing. So we need to sort of reinvigorate that. We need a more distributed network of people in the countryside, developing new types of all right. We need a more peopled agriculture, basically, and particularly horticulture. I would say that as a market grower, but that's the real basis of it. We need to have kind of hinterlands around market towns. The old idea of the green belt was, the original idea of that was to preserve rural land so that people could produce food for the towns and cities, and it's kind of turned into this green belt. You can't have people living there. I mean, we had this long-running planning battle to be able to live and work on our land to make it productive. So we need to just start thinking about the whole geography of space in a very different way, not these kind of global supply chains that are completely propped up on fossil fuels, but actually local supply chains of people producing food, not commodity crops, but actual food and fibre. We need to think about woodland as well and other fibre crops. But we basically just need to rethink that entire kind of local geography of rural and urban relations. And I think there's a lot of promising possibilities to do that in terms of rural, village, small town, market town sort of space. It gets harder with the big cities, and in a sense, they have been driven very much by the availability of cheap energy, cheap water, the ability to move things to the city and move wastes out, and they extend this huge global reach. And I think that is going to be problematic in a lower energy future, and quite apart, as you rightly say as well, and a lot of them are coastal, and they've got enough things to worry about without a whole bunch of refugees from the countryside being released from farming. So we need to rethink this very, very thoroughly.
Yeah, and I think, and this is my last question to Chris, and then we're going to turn to you for you to ask any questions. But farming is associated with feeding the nation. Now, what was very interesting to me many years ago when I first became a politician, back in 1999, at the beginning of what was then called the National Assembly for Wales, one of the first questions ever asked was, how much does farming contribute towards the economy? Anybody know the answer? It's either nothing or negative, generally. But that's only if you look at it as an economy. Whereas actually, without farming, we don't get sustained as humans. So there's a kind of how do we look at these things so that we're thinking about the relationship between our society, our economy, and our environment, and indeed our culture? Because unless we start looking at things in a more holistic way, we won't necessarily see the value of things that may look less efficient when you look at them in a very specific way, but might be hugely important because of the co-benefits that it gives, which for me is going back to, I know that we have probably increased the species on our little organic gem surrounded by the sterile nature of the pesticide-led fields. I know how much we've increased our biodiversity in that area over that period of time. So when we're thinking about co-benefits, what would you like to see in terms of the small farm future delivering, and this is second book, not first book, because this is in response to the idea that there are alternative ways of feeding the world, but they lose all those elements of culture and society and environment. So, what would you like to see for the future system?
Right. Well, I mean, maybe just to jump on one thing you said there, which is something that maybe people don't think about as much as they should. You know, you mentioned the kind of pesticide-laced countryside around you, and that, you know, pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, you know, they're sort of presented to us as this sort of modern technological miracle, but they're actually a labour killing. You know, that they have been the mechanism by which labour has been removed from the countryside, and the price of that has been an absolute ecological catastrophe. And you know, people sort of point the finger at farmers, and you know, this is always a difficult argument, because this is what we have asked our farmers to do this. You know, it's easy to say, well, look at you farmers, you know, it's terrible what you're doing. You know, this is on us as well as non-farmers.
Yes,
you know, this
system.
is, you know, it's a systemic thing, and it's very much to do with this notion of getting labour out of farming, you know, making farmers kind of as far as possible stand on their feet as business operators and produce cheap food. So what I would like to see, there's a great book by Dave Goulson. I don't know if some of you know, he's a kind of insect expert, and he talks about, I think his book is called Silent Earth or Silent Planet, and he's talking about the so-called insect apocalypse, and, you know, agricultural chemicals are a big part of that. Not the only thing, but a big part of it. And his vision for the future is very similar to mine, actually. Small-scale farming, gardens, allotments, and, you know, some of the research he's done is basically, if people are producing food for themselves on an allotment, say, surprise, surprise, they don't pour pesticides and herbicides all over it. You're thinking about producing, you know, real food, not agricultural commodities for yourself or for your community if you're on a small farm. You also start thinking about natural cycles. You know, we have a lot of trees on our land, for example, that have multiple benefits. You know, and like you're holding, as you just said, you know, you just see the biodiversity proliferating as you make kind of real local decisions about integrating, you know, whether it's livestock and grassland, cropland, gardens, woodland, and bringing the people in as well. So, you know, yeah, that's what I would like to see, a kind of, that, you know, basically everywhere in the world has figured out a low energy local agriculture that typically involves a mix of woodland, grassland and cropland. And, you know, you get the sort of critique that, you know, George Monbiot is, you know, he talks a lot about bucolic idyls and romantic fantasies and all this. You know, this isn't about going back or trying to recreate some past image, but, you know, if we sort of get over ourselves a little bit, we can learn from our forebears, we can learn from agricultures in other parts of the world where, you know, people have figured this stuff out long term, and obviously we can apply modern knowledge and, you know, greater scientific knowledge that we have now, but, you know, people figured out these ecologies pretty darn well over long periods of time, and, you know, and we can build you know, a more peopled, a gentler, a more socially equitable agriculture on the basis of it. You know, it's basically about the politics. But you're the politician. Yeah. You're the politician, so you can tell me how to do this. You know.
But I think, yes, actually just down the road from here lives a man called Herbie Girardet, and some of you may know of his work on the ecopolis, the idea of an eco-city where everything is integrated. So it is low zero carbon, and all the food needs are integrated. The water is clean. You know, things that we're only dreaming about at this particular moment here in our beautiful country of Wales. Over to you.